Welcome to our deep dive. And today we're going to be taking a closer look at Aaron Burr.
Okay.
Now, you might know him as the guy who ended Alexander Hamilton's career permanently,
Right.
but
Yeah. Yeah.
there's a whole other side to this story that often gets overlooked.
Yeah, there is.
That's right.
Burr's life goes way beyond that fateful duel. We're going to be exploring his alleged conspiracy to potentially break up the United States.
Yeah. And we're going to be using a really interesting source to guide us today, an episode of American History Tellers featuring historian James E. Lewis Jr., author of The Burr Conspiracy.
Great source.
Get ready, because this is a historical puzzle with some serious twists and turns.
Yeah, it is. It's a story that really highlights the anxieties and uncertainties of a young nation trying to find its footing.
Yeah.
Burr's actions and the reactions they sparked revealed just how fragile the early American Republic really was.
So to really get into this,
Yeah.
we need to understand the world Burr was living in.
Right.
We're talking about the early 1800s, where duels weren't just for show. They were a serious way to settle disputes, especially in the political arena.
Exactly. Honor was like social currency back then, and not just for the elite. It was crucial for spreading information and building trust. Newspapers would even cite letters from gentlemen of honor and respectability to give their reporting more weight.
It's hard to imagine reputation being that important, isn't it?
It's true.
It was almost like an early form of social proof, but with much higher stakes.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about Burr himself. He started out as a Jeffersonian Republican, but became increasingly disillusioned with the political landscape, especially after the tumultuous election of 1800.
Hold on, can you remind me about what the political scene was like back then? Weren't political parties kind of a new thing?
Yeah, they were actually viewed with suspicion.
Really?
And even prominent figures would downplay their party affiliations. The American History Tellers episode actually draws some interesting parallels between that era and the divisive political climate we've seen in recent elections.
Wow. So some things never change.
Apparently not.
So Burr's political career is stalling, and he sets his sights on the West. Just picture the American West in the early 1800s, vast, untamed, full of potential, but also a bit daunting, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And at the time, there was a real fear that the West would eventually secede from the United States.
Hmm.
The Mississippi River, while not a natural boundary in the truest sense, played a role in fueling this anxiety. It makes you think about how ideas of national unity and division have evolved over time, doesn't it?
It really does. The Mississippi is a dividing line.
Yeah.
It's a striking image.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to Burr. He's out west, and rumors start swirling. He's recruiting men, stockpiling supplies, building boats.
Right.
What was he really up to out there?
That's the question that had everyone on edge, and then a mysterious cipher letter surfaces sent to President Jefferson from none other than General James Wilkinson.
Okay.
The plot thickens when you learn that Wilkinson was a paid Spanish spy.
Wait, hold on. A Spanish spy. That's a twist. I wasn't expecting you could make this stuff up.
It's true, and to make matters worse, the letter itself was incredibly vague, which only fueled more suspicion and speculation.
Okay, so we've got a potential conspiracy brewing, possible treason, and now international espionage thrown into the mix. This is getting good.
It is.
But what about Burr himself? The sources describe him as being incredibly charismatic, almost magnetic.
Right?
He managed to attract followers even as his actions became increasingly questionable. What was it about him that made people want to believe in him?
Well, the sources we've looked at describe Burr as having a certain captivating quality. One account mentions how he could hold a room spellbound with his wit and storytelling.
Yeah.
He knew how to tailor his message to appeal to people's hopes and fears, even persuading them to act against their better judgment.
That's a fascinating but also kind of scary talent to have.
It does speak to a deep understanding of human psychology and a knack for persuasion.
Now, of all the places Burr's activities stirred up trouble, Kentucky seems to have been particularly caught up in the frenzy. Why was that?
Well, Kentucky had a unique history that made it especially susceptible to these kinds of fears back in the 1790s. There was an incident known as the Spanish Conspiracy, where some prominent Kentuckians, including, believe it or not, our double-dealing friend General Wilkinson, made secret deals with Spain.
Whoa.
This fueled a long-lasting sense of paranoia and distrust within the state.
Wow, so when Burr shows up, it's almost like history repeating itself.
Mm-hmm.
People were already primed to believe the worst.
Precisely, Burr's arrival tapped into those existing anxieties, making it seem like old betrayals were resurfacing. And of course, we can't forget the role of the media in all of this. In the early 1800s, newspapers were the primary source of information. It was like the social media of its day, spreading news and sometimes exaggerating stories like wildfire.
Right, and it wasn't exactly an unbiased media landscape either.
No, it wasn't. Almost all newspapers were openly partisan, which further distorted the information circulating about Burr and his activities.
So with public opinion reaching a boiling point, President Jefferson finally decides to step in. It must have been a tricky situation to navigate.
It was initially Jefferson avoided mentioning Burr by name in his public pronouncements. He was likely cautious due to a lack of solid evidence and didn't want to escalate the situation unnecessarily. However, as the situation progressed, he began to use the crisis to advocate for his own political philosophy of limited government and the importance of citizen action.
So he turned a potential political disaster into an opportunity to promote his own agenda. That's pretty clever, actually.
It was a shrewd move indeed, and with that, the stage was set for a major showdown, Burr versus Jefferson, with the fate of the young nation hanging in the balance.
This is where things get really interesting. Burr's arrest and upcoming trial captivated the nation, becoming the first major legal spectacle in American history.
Yeah.
But we'll have to dive into that after a short break. Stay with us.
Okay.
We're back, and the tension is building last we left off. Burr was under arrest, facing charges of treason, and the whole nation was watching. This wasn't just a trial, it was a full-blown spectacle.
It was like the nation's first big legal drama unfolding, crowds, headlines, and these incredibly high stakes. I mean, we're talking Chief Justice John Marshall presiding, some of the best lawyers battling it out, and a former vice president fighting for his freedom and his legacy.
Okay, I have chills. This must have been the hottest topic of conversation everywhere you went. It makes today's courtroom dramas look tame.
Yeah, for sure.
So tell me, what were some of the key legal precedents that came out of this landmark case?
Well, for one, the trial sparked a lot of debate about the limits of executive power. Could a president be forced to turn over documents?
Yeah.
But maybe the most enduring legacy was how the trial clarified what treason actually meant.
Mm-hmm.
They set this really high bar for what constituted treason, which ultimately helped protect against political abuse.
Wow. So it wasn't just about Burr's fate, it was about shaping the very foundation of the American legal system.
Exactly. And speaking of Burr's fate, the verdict might surprise you.
Don't leave me hanging. Was he found guilty?
He was acquitted. The prosecution just couldn't meet that strict definition of treason that had been established during the trial.
I can only imagine how Jefferson felt about this. Right. He and Burr were already rivals, and this must have felt like a huge blow.
Oh, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. Jefferson saw this whole ordeal as a way to discredit the judiciary, even going so far as to push for term limits for Supreme Court justices. It's a bit ironic, don't you think, the champion of states' rights trying to increase federal power over the judicial branch?
It's definitely a twist. So Burr walks free, Jefferson's fuming, and the young nation is left trying to make sense of it all. What happened to Burr after all of the dust settled? Did he just disappear from public life?
Well, not quite. He actually spent a few years in Europe.
Really?
Get this, even steaming with Napoleon for a time.
Wow.
But eventually he came back to New York and tried to rebuild his life as a lawyer. But from the sources we've gathered, it seems like the scandal and personal tragedies he endured really took a toll on him.
Yeah, you can't go from almost being president to being a political pariah and not be affected by it. And you mentioned personal tragedy.
Sadly, yes. Burr lost his grandson and then his daughter, both of whom he was very close to the sources, paint a picture of a man who, despite his outward ambition, was deeply affected by these losses.
It sounds like Burr's story is a cautionary tale of ambition, intrigue, and ultimately tragedy. But looking beyond the individual, what are some of the larger questions that the Burr conspiracy raises, questions that we might still be grappling with today?
Well, one of the big ones is the question of intent. Can we ever truly know what was going on in Burr's mind? Was he a true traitor, an opportunist, looking for a power grab? A visionary who was simply misunderstood, or just a pawn in a larger game of partisan politics? The sources we have don't offer a clear answer, which I think adds to the intrigue of the whole story.
Absolutely. It makes you want to keep digging for clues and piecing together different perspectives. In fact, after this deep dive, I'm going to have to check out that full episode of American History Tellers and see if I can uncover some more insights.
Yeah, it's definitely worth a listen. It's a really well-produced show, and they do a great job of bringing history to life.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Burr's complex legacy, the fragility of the young nation, and the ever-present influence of partisan politics. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to ponder, something that wasn't explicitly laid out in our sources. What if Burr had actually succeeded in his ambitions? What would a nation divided along the Mississippi look like today?
Now, that's a thought-provoking question. It really highlights the power of what-if scenarios in history and how individual choices or the choices of a small group of individuals can have a ripple effect that shapes the destiny of an entire nation.
It really makes you think about the course of history and how differently things could have turned out. It also highlights how those anxieties and divisions from the early American Republic might still resonate with the challenges facing the United States today. But we'll have to save that conversation for another deep dive.
Indeed, there's always more to explore, and history often has surprising connections to our present if we look closely enough.
Well said. Now, before we go any further down that rabbit hole, let's take a moment to recap some of the key takeaways from our deep dive into the Burr conspiracy and offer some additional resources for those who want to keep learning. We'll be right back after a quick break.
And we're back. I don't know about you, but this deep dive into Aaron Burr's life has really got me thinking. We've gone from duels at dawn to whispers of treason, uncovered Spanish spies, and even explored the birth of America's partisan media. What a wild ride through history.
It really has been, and as we wrap up, I'm curious what stood out to you the most about Burr's story.
For me, it's the fact that a single event, that duel with Hamilton, has completely overshadowed a life that was so much more complex. Burr was a brilliant legal mind, a captivating leader, and someone who clearly understood the anxieties of his time and knew how to use them to his advantage. That's a great point. It reminds us that historical figures are more than just single actions or labels. Burr, for better or worse, played a significant role in shaping the early years of the American Republic.
And it's fascinating how his story is so intertwined with the development of the American political system, especially when it comes to the judiciary. That trial set some truly important legal precedents that still resonate today.
It did. And thinking about the Burr conspiracy as a whole, it really exposes just how fragile the young nation was, the fear of secession, the influence of a partisan press, the role of personal ambition. All of these factors played a part.
It really makes you appreciate the delicate balance it takes to hold a nation together.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that democracy is an ongoing experiment, something that requires constant vigilance and a commitment to shared values if it's going to succeed.
Well said. Now, before we wrap up, are there any other resources you'd recommend for listeners who are eager to learn more about Aaron Burr and this fascinating period in American history?
Well, besides that American History Tellers episode we've been discussing, I highly recommend James E. Lewis Jr.'s book, The Burr Conspiracy. It's a well-researched and nuanced look at this pivotal moment in American history.
Fantastic. We'll make sure to include a link to that in the show notes. What about primary sources? Are there any letters or journals from that era that you think would provide a valuable firsthand perspective?
Absolutely. There's a treasure trove of primary source documents available, online letters, journals, even newspaper articles from the time. Reading those firsthand accounts can really bring the past to life and offer a glimpse into how people experienced these events as they were happening.
Great suggestions. Well, I think it's time to bring our deep dive to a close. Any final thoughts for our listeners? Something to leave them pondering as they go about their day.
How about this? How do the anxieties and divisions of the early American Republic resonate with the challenges facing the United States today? Are there parallels to be drawn? And what lessons can we learn from the past as we navigate the complexities of our present?
That's a powerful question, one that I think we'll all be wrestling with for a long time to come. It's amazing how history has a way of repeating itself, or at least rhyming, as the saying goes.
It's true, history may not offer easy answers, but it can give us valuable perspective and a deeper understanding of the world around us.
Well said. To all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on the deep dive. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning. Until next time.